we're meeting at a very important time in our country's history when it comes to corruption and state capture. And I want to welcome all of you here. And in particular, I want to welcome our guest, Athol Williams, the author of this book called Deep Collusion. We also have a respondent, Mbathe. Zen holds a BA in International Studies degree from Stellenbosch University. She also holds a postgraduate diploma in Sustainable Development from Stellenbosch University School of Public Leadership. And as a postgraduate researcher at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition, she engaged in research around state capture and governance issues. She's currently an investigator with Open Secrets, and she's completing an MPhil. Athol, we need no introductions. He's graced our television screens during the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. He's an expert in ethics and corporate governance, a South African activist and an award-winning author of 18 books. He's the first person to earn 5 master's degrees from 5 global top-ranked universities. In addition to a bachelor's degree from the University of Witwatersrand, Athol holds a master's degree from MIT Sloan School of Management, the London Business School, the University of Oxford, Harvard University, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. So he's also a poet, and he's the founder of the Institute of Social and Corporate Ethics, and the co-founder of Read to Rise, an NGO that promotes youth literacy. He's held executive positions in financial services, mining and management, consulting companies. His contributions to social development and literature have been recognized by the Western Cape government and the City of Cape Town and Lead SA. But we all know Athol for exposing the corporate corruption and state capture and the role of corporate companies such as Bain. So with that introduction, we're going to ask people to participate in this particular webinar. And before we hand over to Athol, I'm going to just indicate some house rules. If you want to ask questions, please make use of the chat box. This allows for the panelists to also see the questions and answer it where we have time. If you do want to ask a question, please put on your camera and please mute your mics for the duration of the talks by our panelists. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Athol to speak about his new book, Deep Collusion. Thank you very much. Athol.
Thank you, Irvin. So the book, as Irvin said, is Deep Collusion. It's at all bookstores. Just a few words about the book. It's not intended as a comprehensive study of state capture. It's essentially based on my testimony at the Zondo Commission and the evidence I presented. So it's one sliver of the whole story, but hopefully an important sliver of that whole story. The book is quite easy to read. It's not written as an academic book or even as an investigative journalist might write the book, but it's meant to be to give you a good sense of what really happened, but in a way that's easy to read and accessible. For those really interested in state capture and some of the technicalities around it, I'd recommend chapters 12 and 21 in particular, and I will touch on those 2 chapters in this talk, but 12 and 21 give the essence of my understanding of what happened, with the rest of the chapters sort of filling in those gaps. Obviously, it's in the book title, Deep Collusion, Bain and the Capture of South Africa. So Bain and Company is the main protagonist in the book and in the story, but there are many other actors which feature in the book and which obviously feature in the broader state capture saga. I think about Bain's involvement and the way the book is structured and the way I've given my testimony and my campaigning since then in 2 parts. So the first part is really Bain's involvement in state capture. So what really happened, what happened with Zuma, what happened at SARS, what happened elsewhere. And that's one one part of the story. That happens between 2012 and 2018. And that's captured in part B and C of the book. The book's got 4 parts. The second part of the story is the cover-up of what happened. And that runs from, there's a lot of interference.
I'm sorry, there's some interference. So can people please mute the mics?
Mute your mics. The first part of the narrative is around what really happened. The second part is the cover-up, and the cover-up starts in 2018 till today. And a lot of my campaigning since testifying at the Zondo Commission has been around this cover-up, and that's captured in parts A and D of the book. So let me just go to the first part. So what happened in state capture? What are some of the parts in the book that are worth highlighting? And of course, many of us will know the story, but I want to just touch on a few things. An important element here is that Bain & Company, this prestigious global management consulting firm, where I was a senior partner and had worked for many years, essentially became Jacob Zuma's consultant of choice. They met with him, and I've got records of meeting with him up to 18 times, behind closed doors, after hours at his residencies. In these meetings, Zuma shared information with Bain, including who he was going to place at the head of which institutions, how he was going to repurpose some of the institutions, or what his goals were for them. And he endorses Bain. So Jacob Zuma endorses Bain because he endorses Bain by having these meetings with Bain, by including others in these meetings with Bain, and by then introducing Bain to other people within Zuma's network as these guys to speak to. These are the guys that you should speak to. And within this broader relationship that Bain establishes with Zuma and his circle, SARS then becomes just one of the projects within this broader plan. So as I've testified and spoken often, Bain worked across numerous other public institutions and state institutions in our country. They worked at Telkom, at SAA, at Eskom, at Development Bank of South Africa, at the IDC, the PIC, across our state institutions from this period 2012 to 2018. And we only know about SARS because SARS became disabled, and the Nugent Commission was established that then revealed Bain's involvement there. But there's been very little spoken about its involvement in the other areas. And in the book, I reveal, to the extent I had evidence, its involvement elsewhere. And that becomes an important aspect for us when we think about what needs to happen going into the future. Let me just touch on 2 aspects which I think are important, and in those 2 chapters I mentioned. So in chapter 12 of the book, I describe a grand plan. And essentially what the grand plan was, this is what I synthesized from these many documents that I reviewed. And I had 500 pages, sorry, I had 500 documents and submitted an affidavit of 700 pages to the Zondo Commission. It seemed like between Bain and Zuma, they devised this grand plan, which started with a restructuring at the macro level of an industry. So they wanted to restructure the ICT industry, and Telkom became a key part of that. They wanted to restructure the energy sector, and Eskom became a key part of that. And so they lay out these plans for restructuring the industry, then restructuring organizations within the industry. An important part of this restructuring is that they then put in place compliant leaders who Zuma handpicks to go into those positions, and Bain then coaches and prepares for the role to play. And so we see between 2012 and 2015, literally every one of our major SOEs has a new CEO. You just run through them. You go, Eskom, Transnet, SAA, SARS, DBSA, PIC, IDC, all have new CEOs in this period. And this is a critical part of this plan. because it was about restructuring and repurposing industries and the organizations to, in some cases, disable abilities within them. And this is particularly true for SARS. SARS was not about looting per se. It was about disabling SARS investigative abilities to go after people who were evading taxes. So in some cases, it was repurposing certain abilities, and in other cases, it was just weakening governance so that looting could take place. And so there is this grand plan, which Bain develops with Zuma and others, and they just systematically implement as they go through organizations. In some of the documents that I've had access to that I discuss in the book, Bain talks about how they were tested at Telkom. So the first implementation of the grand plan was actually at Telkom, not at SARS. Telkom's where they were tested, SARS was in the second one. We see evidence that Bain met with Tom Moyane up to a year before he was put in place. This was so that they could work with him to develop the detailed plans, so that when he arrived at SARS, he already had the detailed plans developed. And this is why the Zondo Commission described Bain's involvement at SARS as unlawful, and why the Nugent Commission described Bain's involvement at SARS as a premeditated offensive. This was not coaching that happened. This was not normal consulting relationship. This was a premeditated plan. And no matter what the question was, restructuring was going to be the answer. Because in this act of restructuring, not only would Bain earn massive fees, but it actually achieved the objective, which was to repurpose our state institutions. So that's this aspect of this grand plan. And a big question for us in South Africa has got to be, what have happened to these plans? Because just because Zuma is no longer in power does not mean these plans have disappeared. And my worry is these plans continue to be alive in our country and being implemented to different degrees. Another aspect that happened during this involvement in state capture period was then just what do we mean by state capture exactly. And there's a lot of debate, a lot of discussion on what state capture is. In chapter 21, where I discuss state capture, I firstly place state capture on an illustrative continuum from a democratic state to then corruption, and at the other extreme, a coup. And often, because when we hear state capture, it conjures up this idea of a coup, that people have taken over our country. And of course, we then say, well, that's absurd. No one's taken over our country. So what is the state capture thing? And I place state capture between a coup and corruption, because it's not just simple corruption. It's this web networked effect of corruption that's systematic and planned, involving multiple parties. Often there are parties involved who don't even know the full grand plan. They're just playing their one part. And so state capture is this coordinated effort to influence or control aspects of our state institutions for private gain. And I lay that out in some detail to give an understanding of what we mean by state capture. A second part, importantly, of state capture, which I touch on in chapter 21, is the different roles played by parties in state capture. And so again, we have this tendency to list all the companies and all the individuals involved and say they were involved in state capture. And while that's obviously true, I think it's important for us to think about the different roles they played. And I established just some nomenclature around that and identify 6 categories of participants in state capture. But importantly, I place Bain right near the top end of this involvement, because while most companies that we know of, KPMG, McKinsey, Deloitte, all of these companies were involved in state capture, most of them were involved in the implementation of state capture. They were involved in some aspect of overpricing contracts or charging for something for work they didn't deliver, etc. Only one firm was involved in the planning. And as I said earlier, they sat at the table with Zuma and others to plan this. And so if we think about the different roles companies and individuals played, obviously we would have Zuma near the top, but Bain would be near the top as well, given its role in terms of planning and conceiving of the state capture. So that's the one important part, involvement in state capture. And for me, that's important for us to think about where those plans are, because if we don't address that, if we don't address the systemic issues that led to these plans being developed, there's a risk they be repeated. The second part is the cover-up of state capture and Bain's involvement in this cover-up. And as I said, this started in 2018 with the Nugent Commission and continues to today. It hasn't stopped. And just a few important facts to mention, that no one at Bain was fired for Bain's involvement in state capture. Only one person left the company because of his involvement. This was Vittorio Massone, but he was paid to leave and paid very handsomely to leave. Everyone else was moved around the Bain global system. And I mean, literally within days of the Nugent Commission, all the partners were on planes to other parts in the world so that they couldn't be held accountable in South Africa. The investigation that Bain conducted, which they tell us revealed no wrongdoing, was conducted by their very own lawyers. And these lawyers were giving Bain legal advice as they were conducting this investigation. And you don't have to be a legal scholar to know that such an investigation, of course, is a sham. Because if you conduct an independent investigation, you go into the organization, you conduct the investigation, you compile your report, you hand it to your client and to the investigating commission, and you go your way. These lawyers were advising Bain on what information to reveal to the Nugent Commission. They were advising Bain on whether to put witnesses forward or not. They were advising Bain on strategies of how to deal with the findings of the report. And so we have not seen an independent investigation of Bain's involvement in state capture. And so this continues to be part of the cover-up. And then important, if you're a senior person at Bain today, still at the firm and knowing everything we know now, I would argue that you are also guilty of this cover-up because you are part of this cover-up. And organizations like Business Leadership South Africa, who are defending Bain, are actually legitimizing this cover-up. And companies like Sasol, who are hiring Bain and doing business with Bain, are funding this cover-up. So that gives you the sort of broad overview of these two very important aspects of the story, both what happened during state capture, and we can get into more detail on that, and the cover-up. Because I think in terms of unethical behavior, wrongful behavior, criminal behavior, we mustn't forget the cover-up, because that is where we obstruct justice, where in South Africa, we can't actually hold these parties accountable because this information is being withheld from us. I'd like to touch on just 3 points of reflection as we think about state capture, and just a little bit I've already said. The one is this idea of perpetrators and accomplices. This talk is labeled or titled Accomplices to State Capture. And when we talk about accomplices, we have some implicit assumption of who the perpetrators are. I reject this idea that Zuma and politicians were the main perpetrators of state capture. In my mind, it was the private sector who were the main perpetrators of state capture. Our state was captured by private interests, by business. The Guptas were business people, Bain, business people, McKinsey, Deloitte, Bosasa, SAP, Gartner, all of these companies were business people. They manipulated our state institutions for private gain. And so when we think about perpetrators and accomplices, I'm suggesting we be very clear in our minds about who facilitated this, which was Zuma and the politicians, and who perpetrated it. It was the private sector, it was business. There were many other accomplices along the way. Of course, there were those who supported and facilitated. We know the banks facilitated the moving of money. But there are those, as I've said, who legitimize these perpetrators. There are those who defend them. There are those who continue to do business with them and welcome them into our society. And then there are those who obstructed the revelation of truth as well. And so thinking about accomplices and perpetrators, we need to have some sense of clarity of who we are talking about here. There's a strong rhetoric around, Zuma is the main guy. And of course, Zuma is the main guy because he was the president and he facilitated this whole state capture. But there were many other parties. And as I say, many of the other parties that we often dismiss were actually the key players in the capture. The second idea is this idea of legitimate and illegitimate business. If you think about illicit business or illegitimate business, we think, for example, of the drug business. And the drug business, we'd say, is illegitimate because of the product it sells, right? So it sells cocaine. And so we say, well, if cocaine is an outlawed product, then that business is a criminal and illicit business. And so that's deemed to be bad. But I ask the question about all other businesses in South Africa and say, if these businesses are involved in lies, deception, manipulation, exploitation, harassment, intimidation, manipulating prices, lobbying for favorable legislation at the expense of consumers, or unduly influencing our democratic institutions, then why are these okay? Why don't we classify these as illegitimate or illicit businesses? And so we've got this bifurcation between good and bad around business, and almost all of our energy and focus is around these businesses who are involved in what we think are bad businesses. And nobody wants to touch them because those are bad. But yet, there's this whole group of other businesses who are involved in heinous crimes, but we consider as legitimate businesses who've just made a few mistakes.
1 minute, Athol. 1 minute, thanks.
1 minute, okay. Thank you. We focus on criminals in the back streets and ignore these criminals on our main streets. And so I think, just in closing then, it's important for us to be very clear how we think about good and bad. I think as a country, we've enabled the social systems that allowed state capture. And until we address those social systems, the norms and the institutions behind them, state capture will repeat itself at our great cost. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you very much, Athol, for that insightful talk in terms of what you've put in your book. I'm sure people will be very interested to read those plans as you've indicated in the book. Without any further hesitation, I'm going to hand over to Zen to look at the response and also address where do we go to from here in terms of investigations, because what you've put there is public now. It's out in the Zondo Commission, and we have the investigative director that's supposed to be looking at some of those particular issues. So Zen, Mbathe, welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Irvin, and thank you to Athol. I think just picking up on what Athol you've said, and on the book and what's present in the book, I think one of the main things that comes forward in Deep Collusion is it's an interesting take on focusing on a particular private sector entity and a single one in that, and framing it in the bigger conversation. And I think what really is highlighted in the book is not only it's exactly the point that you talked to about Bain being involved in a different way, in the sense of the private actor being involved from conception to collusion to capture. And I think that is one of the main points that you highlight throughout the book, is this, the information is out there, and as a public, it's available to us. But I think it's what Deep Collusion does so well, is that it connects the dots for us in one single stop shop. It joins the dots of the story of Bain. And I think sometimes in the conversation around state capture, it is difficult to pull all of these strings together and to see what we have and what we don't have and what information is out there, and to process that and to digest it. And I think what Deep Collusion does so well is to do exactly that in the context of a single global consulting firm such as Bain. And it's exactly this issue of private sector enablers, which Open Secrets submitted a submission to the Zondo Commission and released its investigative report to the enablers, that draws on a number of private sector entities, including Bain, that were part of this network of capture, without whom state capture would not have been enabled. And so when we're talking about these private sector enablers, we're talking about, a network of capture, but windows of opportunities where capture could have been stopped, and where capture was then, the door for capture was open, and allowed this network to run rampant globally and within the country. And it's from an open secrets perspective, the enablers draws on all of those actors. And I think it's also important to be able to home in and drill down in more detail as more information has become public in the context of Bain, and I think, Athol, what you've done in Deep Collusion, to really focus on some of those actors individually and to really paint their own story. Because it's one thing to look at the network more broadly, which I think Open Secrets does in a lot of our work on private sector enablers, and in doing that, we connect the dots more broadly. But how do we drill down to these specific actors, and we really home in on a single global consulting firm entity like Bain? And I think, just to focus a little bit and speak to the issue of SARS, and I think what happened, from this conception, collusion to capture, that Bain engaged in SARS, there were 17 meetings between Tom Moyane, the then director of South Africa Bain, Victoria Mazzoni, and Jacob Zuma, which means, they met every 6 weeks between 2012 and 2014, and that's a period of 4 years. And in our understanding, with a lot of the information coming forward over the last 3 to 4 years on capture, it just goes to show that a global consulting firm like Bain really was doing the legwork, knowing very well that it was doing, I think, what Athol mentioned, illegitimate business. And it really goes back to the point of Bain, is known as the KGB of consulting, and that's the name that was given to them back in the day. And it's almost as though they've established a pattern of doing business. And it just so happened that this time South Africa was the target, with Telkom as a blueprint and SARS the next target. And why SARS is so important, I think, Athol, you've done well to kind of paint the broader picture of Bain and really speak to how there were other state entities that were also involved, and that Bain was targeting and was engaged in. I'll speak specifically to a project that was put together by Bain, Zuma, and the likes of Tomiana and other and Mazzoni and other politicians, called Project Phoenix. And that Project Phoenix was, exactly as Athol explained, even in Deep Collusion, and we've seen in coming forward in the testimonies and the information of the New Gender Commission, and again in the Zondo Commission, was a targeted offensive of not only one state institution, but state institutions across the country. And I think, the history of Bain in South Africa begins in 1997. It comes into the country then and doesn't quite get a foothold in terms of business in the country as I think it would have liked. And it makes very clear that this access to public entities was the way that it was going to make money. And so that kind of plan was a plan that was very clearly not in the public interest, and very clearly in efforts to make reams of profit for Bain, whether that was through legitimate or illegitimate processes. And it just so happens that it turns out to have been illegitimate processes. And I think with the case study of SARS, just to drill down on that, it's what the Zondo Commission calls an emphatic example of how state capture happened in other state institutions, and how private sector enablers were the linchpin in enabling capture across our state institutions. Differently though, again to mention, is Bain's involvement from conception. And I think that's what's so important. And I think, just to speak to the issue of SARS, is why it's so important. So before Bain enters its contract with SARS, and which was illegitimately awarded to it, SARS was a reputable state institution. And during the reign of Bain and Tom Moyane at SARS, tax collection agency failed to meet its revenue targets. between 2014 to 2017. And just to give some numbers, you know, the shortfall grew in 2014 and 2015 to 7.3 billion. And then in 2016 and 2017 it was 30.7 billion. And when we're talking about the public cost and the human cost, we see a GDP ratio that has increased by nearly 50% when it comes to debt repayments continuing to grow, and the pressure on the fiscus. And when we're talking about a revenue collection agency that is meant to enable social spending and a response to COVID, we had a fiscus that was completely drained and a SARS collection institution that was debilitated and completely gutted. And the public cost of that we've all felt. And I think now, I think it came out in the news like a day or two ago that SARS revenue collection, you know, has been, you know, has hit a good trajectory at 1.5 trillion. And again, that's great and shows what happens at a SARS, at a public tax agency that is able to be steered under the right leadership. But again, that's great, but how many years have we lost? And how much of that has affected the public? And you know, with global consulting firms like Bain refusing to be held to account and skirting really the issue of coming out. They've come up with public apologies, but there's no admittance of guilt in that. They keep portraying themselves as an unwitting pawn in the political agenda that they were unaware of. And that is absolutely unacceptable. And you can see in that kind of a stance that that's a global consulting firm that's based in America with a subsidiary in South Africa, that there is the sense that, you know, global businesses can skirt the laws of their domestic countries and use South Africa as a scapegoat for those laws, and ultimately to evade the law and to do bad things. And I think I'll hand back to you just now, just to respond to that. But I think in Deep Collusion and in talking about private sector enablers and how these private sector entities can be held to account, it would start with really applying public pressure in really saying you cannot, after these reams of evidence, the first Nugent Commission came out, the second Zondo Commission has come out, and the evidence is stacked against you. How can you really be saying that you had no idea what you were doing and use a scapegoat, perhaps in some ways, to say we've paid back the money and that's done? You've crippled a state institution that is still trying to recover during a pandemic, and it's more than a 200 million bill. And that's chump change for a company, a global consulting firm like Bain. And so you can see in the sense of this targeted offensive that sometimes there's almost, it seems, a risk analysis behind closed doors of, okay, we're going to pay back the money if we do get caught, but 200 million in the big scheme of things of how much they were going to earn and looking to earn, and the business foothold it was working to get, is really, for global consulting firms like Bain, I think a math that they sometimes calculate. But when we're talking about moving forward, how we hold these private sectors to account, private sector enablers to account, we're really also looking at the American system. This is an American-based firm, and it's also up to, as much as it's up to our own judicial system and the NPA and our own criminal justice system to be acting to hold these private sector enablers to account. In the case of Bain, as a US-based entity, the laws in America should be are fully clear on the fact that a global consulting firm that is a US-based consulting firm cannot be paying intermediary parties to be doing business. And so we need to be, I think, coordinating with the US states to bring these perpetrators to book. But beyond that, it's also on America and also on the United States to step into that gap and to use the might of the law that is already there to hold their own private sector enablers to account. Otherwise, I think it's very clear that there is a stance by the United States that we are supporting global corruption being exported under the American flag. And so, yeah, I think in terms of what are the next steps, I think it's really just applying public pressure to the relevant parties to step in the gap and to take swift and decisive action. But yeah, I don't know, Irvin, if my time's up, but just to hand back to Athol a little bit to comment on there.
Thank you very much, Zen, for your insights. I think we're going to open up the floor, but before we do open up the floor for questions and comments, and I will give you another opportunity, Athol. I want to pose these two questions to both of you. Firstly, at the center, we're looking at something very, very, very different. You know, we've categorized in the past, and criminological studies have done this for years, to categorize the offender in our country as poor and black. And what we're seeing here is that that is being inverted with the revelations of the Zondo Commission and the revelations in your book. And so maybe it's time to shift our gaze from crimes of the poor to crimes of the powerful. And it's something that we really invest in here at the center. And so I do want to ask you, in your own categorization of state capture and putting it on a linear scale from that of a coup to corruption, do we characterize our state as a criminal state, Athol? I want to pose that to you. And I'd like to hear your comments on that. And to Zen, in terms of investigating all of these crimes, maybe you can speak to us about the capacity and the capabilities of the state to investigate this crime. I want to take another example, Steenhoff, and the investigations into Steenhoff, and who was charged and who was brought to book and so forth. So let me leave it there. And then I also want to encourage participants, if you want to ask questions, you're free to use the chat box or just put up your hand and then we can acknowledge you. Over to you, Athol.
Irvin, I agree completely with your idea that we've characterized the criminal as black and poor. I made the statement that we are looking for criminals in the back streets when we should be looking for them in the high street, right? What's striking for me is that, and also I made this distinction between legitimate and illegitimate business, and I think we've got it wrong there, right? We've got companies who are involved, like I said, in heinous activities, but under this umbrella of legitimate business. And what strikes for me is how we celebrate these criminals, right? If you think about who gets the accolades in our country, who's got honorary degrees, who's on the boards of institutions, these are the very people we are talking about here. And then what I've tried to do at great personal cost to me, and still great personal cost to me, is name them. So Zen talks about Project Phoenix, but a key figure in Project Phoenix was Sipho Maseko, the outgoing CEO of Telkom, who no one wants to tackle in terms of his involvement in these issues. We've got Bain saying that Telkom designed their RFP for Bain, and Bain went and earned R1 billion at Telkom, and yet nobody wants to touch Sipho Maseko. Jabir Mabuza was the chairman of Telkom at the time. So Irvin, and this comments on Zen's comment as well of what we do next is, firstly, I think we're afraid of these people, right? And so people say to me, Athol, you're an idiot. I mean, you're supposed to be smart. You're the biggest fool because you're naming these names. These are unmentionable names. These are the people who are heroes. They are our president's friends. And you are giving evidence to suggest that they were involved in state capture. And so we want to focus on the black poor because that's not going to affect our lives. That's not going to challenge anyone's job, right? But when we deal with the real criminals, that's when our jobs are at stake. As a university, that's where your funds are at stake, right? So I'm curious to see when the center does begin to take on the real criminals, who calls you and asks you about your funding, because that's been my experience, right? I was employed at a top African university for a while and was asked to leave. And so this issue, as Zen mentions about going after the relevant parties, we can be clear who the relevant parties are. Because we can talk to Bain and McKinsey, absolutely, and we must hold them accountable. But we've also got to be very clear about those companies today who are doing business with Bain. right? Why is there no outcry against Sasol? Sasol is paying Bain today, with all that we know, hundreds of millions of rands, and there's no outcry. Business Leadership South Africa, with a board made up of Nedbank and Standard Bank and all these reputable companies, they're the ones that readmitted Bain, and if not for my speaking up, would still be members. So we as society are apathetic. We are the biggest enablers of state capture because we remain silent when we see it. So to your question, are we a criminal state? I don't, that's a technical definition. We are an unethical society, right? Because we are seeing the wrong and looking the other way. We are literally every day seeing the bad that's happening and we're looking the other way. And I think that extends then to our state.
Thank you, Athol. I'm going to hand over to Zen, and you're free to also comment on some of the areas that Athol has raised now. Thanks.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Erwin. And I think just following on from what Athol has mentioned, what we have, I think, are bottlenecks in our system. And I think what Athol is speaking to is, this issue of key individuals moving across the system and across the sector, beyond private sector entities who seem to have this revolving door that allows them to continue to do what they are doing and enabling capture and corruption. We also have key individuals that are moving throughout the system. And I think when we're talking about bottlenecks in our society, we're talking about a corrupt system of network where even when justice is trying to be, when change is afoot and justice is apparently on the horizon, we have individuals that have moved across the sectors that are blocking, that are blocking progress. And when we're talking about, I think just speaking to this point that Athol is talking about with regards to Business Leadership South Africa, we have Business Leadership South Africa, a board and a leadership of Business Leadership South Africa, for example, Mike Brown, sitting at the helm of Business Leadership South Africa, but we have him sitting at the head of Nedbank, and we have Nedbank implicated in state capture. And the same is to be said about Standard Bank, and who's sitting at the helm of Standard Bank and who's sitting at the helm of Business Leadership South Africa, and Standard Bank being implicated in Asina Dairy Farm and state capture in the country. So what we have is almost a system that is where key individuals are implicated, but are in key positions in what should be checks and balances, where their interests are above that of the public and the greater good of the country. When we're talking about Bain, and again linking the fact of these private sector entities and enablers and the key individuals that continue to escape justice and evade justice and continue to also be blocks for justice. We have Vittorio Mazzoni, for example. I think Athol spoke to this. He appeared once at the Nugent Commission, who was at the helm of Bain at the time, but not only at the helm, was completely instrumental in facilitating Bain's capture across the country, and particularly in SARS. We have him appearing at the Nugent Commission, perjuring himself, which at the commission, which Athol speaks to in Deep Collusion, and lying under testimony, and then vanishing. We have this Italian foreigner coming into our country at the helm of Bain, evading running rampant and rampage, and completely skirting responsibility. And then when it comes to being held to account, he is not only helped by Bain to move out of the country, he completely evades accountability. And so what we have is this network of both individuals and a private sector network in our country that helps these individuals to evade responsibility, and in that same breath helps itself as an entire industry and as enablers to evade responsibility. Vittorio Mazzoni now is sitting with a huge website. He's working, I think, for Alchemy. He has a website where he's gritting his teeth and smiling as if he wasn't at the helm of gutting our state institution. When it comes to how do we investigate and how do we hold these private actors to account, yes, there is this sense of a broader structural change that needs to to be in place, and that's with our criminal justice system, in tandem with those across the world, because it's a global network and it's a global system. And I think we need to work hand in hand with criminal justice systems abroad and within our own country. But also it is going for the low-hanging fruit when it comes to individuals that we can really we can get on some of these small things, and really, you know, being as precise and targeted as we can in trying to seek accountability, but also thinking more broadly about who are our regulators that are supposed to have been doing their jobs, and how do we enhance our state institutions in that sense to investigate and bring perpetrators to justice. Yeah.
Thank you, Zen, but I'm going to push you a bit there. And maybe Athol, you can also come in here. My question was really, do we have the capacity at the state institutional level? Look at Athol. Athol was brought in as an expert in ethics and governance, and he was able to slip into the governance structures, meet with the president, because where are they expertise to do that? Look at the investigations capacity of our SIU, of the Hawks, and so forth and so on. I'd like you to just comment on that, if you can, and whether in fact you think we do have the capacity as a state, at the state institutional level, to take on some of these huge investigations. Thank you very much.
I think I'll respond, then hand over to you, Athol. I think just if that's okay, just speaking at a state level, I think it's very clear that, for example, the NPA, there isn't necessarily an appetite to prosecute and to go after, you know, the private sector enablers. We've seen, for example, at Open Secrets, whether we're talking about the apartheid banks or we're talking about the enablers of state capture with the likes of PwC, there is very little appetite coming from the state institutions that should be going after the private sector enablers. And I think whether or not we have capacity, I think we've seen at the NPA that, you know, with Hermione Corneer leaving and the issues there and the lack of action that has been very clear to the public, and lack of accountability to the public, that we have an NPA that isn't acting fast enough and swiftly enough. And when we're thinking about, for example, the evidence that has come forward from the Zondo Commission, the NPA was given special permission by the presidency back, I think, in 2021, to be able to access information from the Zondo Commission and access investigations from the Zondo Commission, which was a special order instituted at the time to enable them to move swiftly on a lot of the information that was coming forward. But what happened was the NPA then responded when the first report of the Zondo Commission coming out that now we're going to take action, we're going to form a task team. And it was very clear that no, you've had access to this information, especially given to you a year or two ago. And so why now are you performatively responding so that you can placate the public to seem as though action is being taken when really that's not the case? And so state institution-wise, I think we're lacking in the capacity there and the appetite to be seen. And beyond that, we have bottlenecks of people who were implicated in state capture sitting in our criminal justice system agencies, who we have no information about why they are still there. And so what we have is an overburdened civil society sector that is pushing the duty of the state and our criminal justice system to try and push for accountability. But we have a criminal justice system and an NPA that isn't moving and is sitting with implicated individuals. And so whether we have capacity, and this is not to sound like there's no hope, but it would seem it's a capacity issue, but it's also an appetite issue and an accountability issue. And yeah, so I'll add that.
I think there's no will. I think we lack the will. I mean, it's part of what Zen's saying, appetite. The capacity exists in the country, right? We are just not. We have no interest in going after the perpetrators. I have not ever been contacted by any authority who's conducting any investigation into anything I've testified about, right? And when I speak to other state capture witnesses and whistleblowers, they say the same thing. So who is the NPA speaking to? This is not a capacity issue, Irvin. We can fix the capacity issue very easily because the capacity exists in our country. We can bring them into the NPA. Just we lack the political will because everyone, it's this network effect, right? I mean, we have the head of Business Leadership South Africa saying, if they were to suspend every company involved in corruption, they'll have to suspend all their members, right? There's our answer, right? There's our answer. Our answer is we're saying everyone is involved, and so therefore nobody wants to hold anyone accountable. And so this isn't an NPA issue. It's much broader for us as society to say, you know, either we're going to say, let everything just go, or we're going to be serious about holding people accountable. The fact that I'm still silenced and exiled is because our government, despite all my attempts and appeals, has no interest in offering me protection. What do we read into that?
Irvin, you're on mute at the moment.
Thank you very much, Athol and Zen, for those responses. I ideally want to encourage participants to ask questions to the two panelists. I see there has been one from Anine Kriegler, and that is to both of you. Could you please explain how Bain framed this project, both internally and with clients? Presumably they didn't sit in meetings with staff, shareholders, and so forth. So maybe you can speak to that in the meantime. And I'm not sure if people are silenced or if they can use the chat box function, but please put up your hands so that we can see you if you do have any questions for the panelists. Thank you.
Just to get a question, Irvin, to Anine's question, Bain would not have discussed this with anyone outside the organization because of Zen described them as the KGB of consulting. There's massive secrecy about what they do. Everything's code worded. And often even within the firm, you don't know what the guy sitting next to you is doing or working on. And so these things can happen in a way that no one knows about them. But importantly, what I describe in the book Deep Collusion and in my testimony, this idea that Masone acted alone is of course completely nonsensical, because he would have worked with the leadership team in South Africa because he couldn't have done all of this work on his own. He worked with a team in South Africa, and there's all the documents I've supplied which show him speaking to his boss in London and his bosses in Boston, the head office. And so it was known all the way up Bain's leadership chain what was happening in South Africa, what they were doing, and why they were doing it. They entered into a contract with an intermediary who has no business expertise, who offered the real value of being able to open doors to Zuma. And so this was conscious, premeditated, and done with full intent.
Thank you. We have a hand, Gavin Krathel. Go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Athol. Nice to be speaking to you again. Look, I'm also a whistleblower. I've had my life turned upside down in ways that are difficult to imagine. But the thing that, and I mentioned this to the DCJ when I was giving evidence, you know, at the closing off of my evidence, he asked me, is there anything that you want to share? And the thing that really stuck out for me was how pathetic Parliament were. Parliament has got enormous powers to head off the kind of thing that I saw going on. And I was starting to kick doors down in Parliament in 2016, even before the Zuma leaks came about, because I could see things were going wrong, and I could see, I didn't know, I didn't have the kind of, all these terms that we've developed now, but I just saw this, this SOE getting run down deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground. And I went to Parliament and I gave them compelling evidence. I said, you really need to come up to Alexander Bay and do oversight. And I went and sat in the office with Zukiswa Rantu, who told me, Gavin, I'm so frustrated because we tried so hard to get oversight meeting in Alexander Bay, but every time we approached Parliament to ask them to give us an oversight opportunity in Alexander Bay, they were told it was too dangerous. The portfolio committee's safety couldn't be guaranteed. Now I've got that.
I'm just aware we've got 5 minutes left, so I just want to make sure I get the chance to respond to your question.
Yeah, so yeah, look, there's a lot more I could say about Parliament. You know, people like Cathy Labuschagne and you know, Ellen Prince were told straight up by their parties, listen, you stay away from Alexcorp. Now, how on earth do you have a situation where people, it's actually it's in the PNG website, you can actually go and read that people like Ellen Prince and people like Cathy Labuschagne and Zekiswa Ranke were told, stay away from Alexander Bay, stay away from Alexcorp. Now, who's gonna be accountable for that? Thank you.
And again, supports the idea, doesn't it? Oh, sorry, Irvin. It again supports this idea that there is no will. This is not an issue of us not knowing what happened. We know what happened. It's just, you know, the Nugent Commission put out a report almost 4 years ago recommending prosecution for what happened at SARS. 4 years ago, not a single person's been prosecuted.
Athol, I know our time is running out, and I think you're right. Nobody has been prosecuted, and I think that's the big issue here. And maybe we are just naive. Maybe this is the way governments and corporate business operates internationally. If one looks at the work of Henny van Vuuren, for instance, and look at the apartheid government and how they've were in bed with the corporate sector, and you look at the work of Andrew Feinstein and look at how political officers play that particular role of facilitators, as you indicated, Athol, then this is the way that we have become accustomed to business running the affairs of political officers and vice versa. And so it is something that we must probe more deeply, and I think your book has opened that particular door to all of us in academia to say, look, maybe it's time that we take the searchlight and we place it elsewhere into crimes of the powerful. And so I want to encourage you, Athol. I know it's difficult for you because of your revelations and the threats that you have received. From our side, we hope that you remain and you stay safe. And again, that's on your own risk and your own resources. And what we have to ask, why is the state not providing you with that particular protection? And so I think the work of Zen must continue, that investigative journalists, you at the moment, when one looks at the work that you're involved in, then this is the foundation stones of building a new partnership and a new country. So from our side, I want to thank everybody that has attended. I do want to remind you that next week we have another seminar. It's a book launch by Darius Divansky on the 14th of April. He speaks to the issues of gang entry and exit, and he will be in conversation with Major General Jeremy Veery on gangs and gang crime in Cape Town. So we also want you to encourage you to attend that. And if you look at the right-hand side of your screen, you'll find the details of that book launch there. So with that, I want to thank Athol for making the time to share, to spend with us, and to Zen for all your valuable time, and to all the participants. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank
Stay
you.
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.